Breaking the Silence, a story of courage and healing. We all think we know what monsters look like. The scary movies show us creatures with fangs and claws, but sometimes the real monster lives in your house. Sometimes he sits at your dinner table. Sometimes he calls himself your father. In the hills of Kentucky, in a small house on a dirt road, 7 sisters learned that the most dangerous monsters don't hide under beds. They hide behind smiles and Bible verses and fake kindness. For 22 long years, the Patton girls lived under the iron fist of Billy Joe Patton. But this isn't just another sad story. This is about something much more powerful. This is about 7 young women who found a strength inside themselves that their father never saw coming. This is about the moment when silence finally broke. And when it did, everything changed. If you want to hear more true stories about courage and survival, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to support our work. Also, tell us in the comments what city you're listening from. This story is researched and backed by court records and news report from Kentucky. Now, back to the story. The house sat on Goose Creek Road in Clay County, Kentucky, far from neighbors, far from help. Billy Joe Patton picked this spot on purpose. He understood something that took investigators years to figure out. If you want to control people completely, you cut them off from the world. No friends, no school, no outside voices. Just his voice, just his rules, just his version of God. Patton homeschooled all 7 of his daughters. But this wasn't about education. This was about isolation. The girls never went to real school, never had teachers ask them questions, never made friends who might notice bruises or hear their stories. Their world was 4 walls, and whatever their father decided to tell them about the outside, he twisted religion into a weapon sharper than any knife. Patton quoted Bible verses, but changed their meaning. He told his daughters that God wanted them to obey him without question, that their pain was part of God's plan, that speaking up was a sin. In that house, his word was holy law. His anger was divine punishment. His control was sacred duty. The girls lived in constant fear. Every morning brought new possibilities for punishment. Every sound of his footsteps made their hearts race. The house had a shotgun displayed where everyone could see it, not for hunting, not for protection from strangers, for them. A reminder of what would happen if anyone thought about running or talking or fighting back. But here's what Billy Joe Patton didn't understand about human nature. He thought fear would make his daughters weak. He thought isolation would make them helpless. He thought breaking their spirits would break their bond with each other. He was wrong on every count. The sisters developed their own secret language, looks that meant danger, touches that meant comfort, small acts of protection that their father never noticed. When one sister was hurt, the others found ways to help. When one sister was scared, the others found ways to give courage. They learned to be a family within a family, a circle of love inside a circle of hate. Their mother Mary lived in the same house. She saw everything, she heard everything, but Mary chose silence. Later, people would argue about whether she was another victim or another abuser. The courts would decide she was both. In 2007, she received 2 years in prison for failing to protect her children. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said she was trapped too. The truth was probably both. In the mid-1990s, the outside world almost discovered what was happening. One of the daughters was hurt so badly that she had to go to the hospital. The doctors looked at her injuries and knew. They'd seen abuse before. They asked questions. They made reports. They tried to help. But without the girl's testimony, their hands were tied. Standing in that hospital room, the daughter faced a choice that would haunt her for years. Tell the truth and risk everything, or lie and go back home to more of the same. Fear won that day. She told the doctors it was an accident. The case was dropped. She went home. But something had changed. She'd seen that people outside her father's house cared about what happened to her. She'd learned that adults existed who wanted to help instead of hurt. Another sister tried running to a neighbor's house. She pounded on the door and begged for help. The neighbor called the police. For a few precious minutes, it looked like rescue had finally come. But by the time the officers arrived, Billy Joe Patton had already gotten to his daughter. He stood beside her as she told the police it was all a misunderstanding, just a family argument, nothing to worry about. The officers had to take her word for it. That sister went back home that night knowing she'd come closer to freedom than ever before. She'd proven to herself that she could run, that she could ask for help, that people would listen. The attempt had failed, but it planted a seed. Running was possible. Help existed. The outside world wasn't the enemy her father claimed it to be. Years passed. The sisters grew from children into young women, but the control never loosened. If anything, it got tighter. Patton knew that adult daughters were more dangerous than little girls. They might find boyfriends who asked questions. They might get jobs that gave them independence. They might realize that other families didn't live this way. So he doubled down on isolation. He preached longer sermons about obedience. He watched them more carefully. He punished them more severely for smaller infractions. He thought he was tightening his grip. But what he was really doing was building pressure that would eventually explode. In 2006, one of the daughters was pregnant with her first child. She was 24 years old, old enough to understand what her father had stolen from her, old enough to imagine a different life for her baby, old enough to finally say enough. Sitting alone one day, she thought about her child growing up in that house, learning to live in fear, learning to accept cruelty as love, learning to stay silent when every instinct screamed to speak up. And she realized she couldn't let it happen. The cycle had to stop. The silence had to break. Even if it destroyed everything, it had to end with her. She picked up a phone and called a relative who lived far from Clay County, far from her father's reach, far from his threats and manipulation. And for the first time in her 24 years of life, she told the complete truth, every detail, every year of abuse, every failed escape attempt, every moment of fear and desperate hope for something better. That phone call changed everything. The relative didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't suggest family counseling or prayer or working things out. They called the authorities, real authorities, people with power to do something about what they were hearing. Investigators opened a case. They gathered evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They prepared warrants. And in July of 2006, they drove up that dirt road on Goose Creek. Billy Joe Patton saw them coming and knew his kingdom was about to fall. The officers entered the house and saw what the daughters had lived with for decades, 7 young women who looked older than their years, bodies that showed signs of chronic malnutrition, living conditions that no human should endure, and in their eyes, a mixture of hope and terror that broke the investigators' hearts. That day, 7 sisters walked out of that house for the last time as prisoners. They were free. After 22 years, they were finally free. Billy Joe Patton was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse, neglect, and sexual assault. His trial began in 2007. His defense was simple: complete denial. He claimed his daughters had made up everything, that they were lying for attention or revenge or money, that he was a good father and a godly man who'd been falsely accused. The daughters testified one by one. Each sister told her story in her own words, different perspectives on the same nightmare, different memories of the same house of horrors. But the details matched. The timeline was consistent. The pattern was clear. These weren't lies or fantasies or vengeful fiction. This was the truth, told by 7 voices that had stayed silent for far too long. Medical evidence backed up their testimony, scars that matched their stories, signs of old injuries that had never been properly treated, growth patterns that showed chronic malnutrition during childhood. The physical proof confirmed what the sisters had finally found the courage to say out loud. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours to process 22 years of testimony and evidence. 3 hours to decide the fate of a man who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable. 3 hours to give 7 sisters the justice they'd waited their entire lives to receive. Guilty on all counts. On November 5th, 2007, Billy Joe Patton was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge called him exactly what he was: a monster. The sisters sat in that courtroom and heard those words and knew they were finally safe. He would never hurt them again. He would never hurt anyone again. But the story doesn't end with his conviction. That was just the beginning of the sisters' real journey. Prison walls couldn't undo 22 years of trauma. A judge's verdict couldn't erase decades of pain. Freedom from their father was only the first step toward freedom from the damage he'd caused. The sisters had to learn how to live in the world. They'd been isolated so long that simple things felt overwhelming. Going to stores, talking to strangers, making decisions without fear of punishment. They had to discover who they were when no one was controlling every aspect of their lives. Some moved far from Kentucky. New states, new names, new identities, built on their own choices instead of their father's demands. Others stayed closer to home, but created boundaries that kept them safe. Each sister chose her own path to healing. They went to therapy. They learned about trauma and recovery and resilience. They discovered that the strength they'd shown in that house had a name: survival. And survival skills could be transformed into thriving skills with time and work and support. The sister who made that first phone call had her baby, then more children. She raised them with love and patience and respect for their voices. She taught them that families should be safe spaces, not war zones, that parents should protect children, not terrorize them, that speaking up about abuse isn't betrayal, it's courage. Another sister became an advocate for other survivors. She spoke at conferences and training sessions. She helped social workers understand what isolation abuse looked like. She worked with legislators to strengthen child protection laws. She turned her pain into purpose. All 7 sisters stayed connected to each other. The bond forged in that house of horrors became their greatest source of strength in freedom. They understood each other in ways no one else could. They celebrated each other's victories and supported each other through setbacks. They proved that love could survive even the worst circumstances. Their story spread beyond Kentucky. Advocates and survivors around the country learned about the 7 sisters who broke their silence. Their courage inspired others to speak up. Their survival gave hope to people still trapped in abusive situations. Their recovery showed that healing was possible even after the worst trauma. Today, more than 15 years after their father's conviction, the sisters live separate lives across the country. They have careers and relationships and children of their own. They've built the families they never had as children. They've created the safety they were denied for decades, but they're still connected by what they survived together. They still understand each other in ways that don't require words. They still carry the strength they discovered in that house on Goose Creek Road. They still remember the moment when one voice saying, "Enough," changed everything. Their father remains in prison. He's in his 70s now. He's lost appeals and parole hearings and attempts to overturn his conviction. The system that failed to protect his daughters as children has kept its promise to keep him away from them as adults. He will die behind bars. The house on Goose Creek Road was torn down years ago. New owners built something else on the land, but locals still remember what happened there. They remember 7 sisters who found the courage to speak truth to power. They remember the day silence finally broke in Clay County. The story of the Patton sisters isn't just about surviving abuse. It's about the power of truth-telling. It's about the strength that comes from supporting each other. It's about the possibility of healing, even from the deepest wounds. It's about the moment when victims become survivors, become thrivers. Most importantly, it's about the ripple effects of courage. When one person speaks up, they give others permission to do the same. When one family breaks the cycle of silence, other families notice. When one set of survivors chooses healing over bitterness, they show the world what's possible. The sisters discovered something their father never understood. Love is stronger than fear. Truth is more powerful than secrets. And sometimes the very isolation meant to weaken people actually makes them stronger. In trying to break his daughter's spirits, Billy Joe Patton accidentally forged them into something unbreakable. In 2023, investigators found journals hidden in the walls during the house demolition, 7 different handwritings, 7 different perspectives on the same nightmare. But every single journal ended the same way, with hope, with dreams of freedom, with faith that someday, somehow, things would get better. Even in their darkest moments, the sisters never stopped believing in tomorrow. The monsters under our beds aren't real, but the monsters in our houses sometimes are. And when they are, the only thing that stops them is someone brave enough to turn on the lights and speak the truth. 7 sisters learned that lesson the hardest way possible, but they learned it, and they used it, and they won.